On a February evening in 2006, Heather Locklear's publicist put out a one-line statement to the press. 11 years of marriage, over. Richie Sambora, the guitarist who'd spent 2 decades helping make Bon Jovi one of the biggest rock bands on the planet, hadn't even been told. He found out from a reporter, backstage, an hour before a show. He told the press it was untrue. He said they'd just celebrated their anniversary. He said he had plans with his wife for Valentine's Day. He was wrong. The papers were already filed. It's easy to file this away as just another celebrity breakup, the kind Hollywood produces by the dozen. But this one didn't end the way most do. It didn't fade into a quiet custody arrangement and a decade of silence. Instead, it marked the beginning of something else entirely, a stretch of nearly 20 years defined by arrests, hospital rooms, rehab stints, and headlines that grew darker each time they appeared. The woman who once seemed untouchable started to look, publicly, like she was unraveling. The question people still ask isn't really about the divorce itself. It's about what came after. How does someone go from the most in-demand actress on American television to a name attached, again and again, to police reports? And was the marriage collapse the cause, or just the moment the cracks became visible? To understand that, you have to go back to who Heather Locklear was before any of it. She broke through in 1981, cast as Sammy Jo on Dynasty, a show built entirely around glamour, betrayal, and excess, and Locklear fit into it like she'd been built for the part. She followed it with T.J. Hooker. Then, in the 90s, the role that turned her into something closer to a cultural fixture, Amanda Woodward on Melrose Place, the ice-cold executive every other character both feared and orbited. She was, for a stretch of years, simply everywhere, a face networks trusted to save a struggling show, a name that guaranteed ratings. Her personal life moved just as fast as her career. At 24, she married Motley Crue drummer Tommy Lee in a lavish Santa Barbara ceremony. That marriage lasted 7 years. Within months of its end, she was engaged again, this time to Sambora. They married in 1994, first in a civil ceremony in New Jersey, then again in Paris, because once wasn't enough for how in love they seemed. In 1997, their daughter, Ava, was born. For a while, it looked like the fairy tale had finally stuck. 2 famous people, a rock star and a TV icon, building a life that outsiders assumed was as solid as it looked on magazine covers. It wasn't. And the first cracks were already forming, long before anyone outside their circle noticed. By the mid-1990s, Heather Locklear wasn't just a working actress. She was one of the most recognizable women on American television. Melrose Place had become appointment viewing, and Locklear's character, the sharp-tongued Amanda Woodward, was part of why. She had the kind of career industry insiders pointed to when a show needed saving. Bring in Heather, watch the ratings climb. Later she'd move into Spin City, playing off Michael J. Fox and then Charlie Sheen, proving she could carry comedy as easily as primetime soap. Magazine covers, awards show red carpets, tabloid front pages. For a solid decade, she rarely left the spotlight. At home, the picture looked just as bright. Sambora was deep into Bon Jovi's most successful touring years, and the couple were regularly photographed as one of the industry's golden pairs, the rock star and the leading lady, a family with a young daughter, a life that seemed to prove fame and stability weren't mutually exclusive. Friends described them as devoted parents. Locklear herself, in interviews from that period, spoke about motherhood changing her priorities, about wanting Ava to have as normal a childhood as Hollywood would allow. But underneath the magazine cover version of the marriage, tension had been building for years, and it wasn't invisible. Long before the 2006 divorce filing, tabloids had already been circulating breakup rumors about the couple, on and off speculation that the marriage was fraying. Locklear and Sambora had spent years denying it, insisting they were solid, even as the rumors kept resurfacing. That pattern, public denial, private strain, would become a defining feature of Locklear's next 2 decades, though no one watching in the late 90s could have known that yet. What almost no one outside their inner circle understood was how much of the strain traced back to something Locklear wasn't talking about publicly, a private struggle with substance use that had been present, in different forms, for years. It wouldn't become public knowledge until much later, but people close to the family would eventually describe a pattern that had already taken root during the marriage. One that had nothing to do with the cameras and everything to do with what happened when they were off. Then came February 2006. The publicist's statement. Sambora's blindsided denial to a reporter an hour before a Washington, D.C. show. The court filings that followed, methodical and already in motion, custody terms for 8-year-old Ava worked out in private, spousal support quietly negotiated behind closed doors. The divorce wouldn't be finalized until the following year, but the announcement alone was enough to end the illusion. The golden couple wasn't golden anymore. For a moment, it still seemed survivable, the kind of split that ends a marriage but not a life. Locklear kept working. She was linked briefly to actor Jack Wagner, her former Melrose Place co-star. Sambora, for his part, continued touring with Bon Jovi, telling interviewers he still loved her, that the timing of the announcement had simply blindsided him. But something had shifted. Friends who spoke to entertainment reporters in the years that followed would later describe this period, not the divorce filing itself, but the months after, as the moment Locklear's private struggles started becoming harder to manage without the structure a marriage, however strained, had provided. Nobody watching from the outside understood yet how much was coming. The first public sign of it was still 2 years away. 2008 was the year the story stopped being about a divorce and started being about something else entirely. It began with a scare. Locklear's own doctor called 911, fearing she had overdosed on prescription medication. Police and paramedics arrived at her home, and for a brief window, tabloids ran with the worst possible version of events. It turned out to be a false alarm, no overdose, no hospitalization for that specific incident. But the fact that it was plausible enough for her own physician to make that call said something. Shortly after, Locklear checked into a treatment facility, spending 4 weeks addressing anxiety and depression. When she came home in July, a friend told reporters she looked radiant, that she was feeling great. For a moment, it seemed like a scare that had led to help, and help that had worked. Then, in September, came the incident that would follow her for years. A witness called California Highway Patrol to report a woman driving erratically through a parking lot near Santa Barbara. Officers found Locklear's car partly on a public road. She had reportedly stumbled out of the vehicle and into a traffic lane. She was arrested on suspicion of driving under the influence. Months later, prosecutors formally charged her with DUI. The case would eventually be resolved with a plea, reckless driving, not DUI, in exchange for the more serious charge being dropped, along with 3 years of informal probation, a fine, and a driver's safety course. To the public, it read as an isolated bad night. But it wasn't isolated. It was the first time the private struggle that had reportedly shadowed her marriage became a matter of public record. Police reports, a mugshot, a court date. The distance between the polished Melrose Place icon and the woman being evaluated on the side of a California highway was, for the first time, visible to everyone. 2 years later, in April 2010, it happened again in a smaller, stranger way. Ventura County sheriffs traced Debris on a public street back to a gated community home and cited her for misdemeanor hit and run. No dramatic arrest this time, no mugshot, just another quiet entry in a growing file. On its own, it might have been forgettable. Stacked on top of 2008, it started to look like a pattern rather than a series of unrelated bad days. What made this period different from ordinary celebrity misadventure wasn't any single incident. It was the accumulation. A false alarm overdose call. A month in treatment. A DUI arrest that became a plea deal. A hit-and-run citation. Individually explainable. Together, they were the first real evidence that whatever had been building quietly underneath the marriage hadn't gone away when the marriage ended. If anything, without the structure Sambora and their life together had provided, it had less to hold it in check. Locklear kept working through all of it, guest spots, occasional roles, red carpet appearances where she looked, by most accounts, entirely fine. That was, in some ways, the most unsettling part. The public version of Heather Locklear and the private one was starting to diverge, and almost no one watching could have predicted how far apart they would eventually grow. The next chapter of her story wouldn't unfold quietly. It would play out in headlines, mugshots, and a 911 call that made the earlier ones look tame. In 2012, Locklear was hospitalized following a prescription drug scare. It barely registered as major news at the time, a line in an entertainment roundup, one more item in a file that was slowly filling up. Compared to what was coming, it would later look like a warning shot nobody fully heeded. 2017 opened, with Locklear entering rehab for undisclosed treatment. She spent much of the year out of the public eye, breaking her silence only occasionally. In September, she made what would turn out to be her last public appearance for years, attending a charity event for the Farrah Fawcett Foundation alongside longtime friend Alana Stewart. Days later, she drove off the road into a ditch and was taken to the hospital with minor injuries. It was treated as a footnote. It wouldn't stay one. By this point, Locklear had reconnected with Chris Heiser, her high school boyfriend from decades earlier, a former motocross champion turned businessman. Their relationship had gone public that same September, and for a while it looked like a grounding presence in an otherwise turbulent stretch. Then came February 2018, and the story became impossible to treat as background noise. Locklear's brother called police after arriving at her Thousand Oaks home and finding her in an altercation with Heiser. What followed was one of the most serious legal incidents of her adult life, an arrest on suspicion of domestic violence, which escalated when, according to authorities, she became combative with the responding officers and paramedics. She was ultimately charged with 4 counts of misdemeanor battery, 3 against emergency personnel, 1 domestic violence count, plus resisting arrest. She pleaded not guilty 2 months later, and the domestic violence charge was eventually dropped, though the battery charges remained. The next day brought a strange coda. Heiser himself was pulled over for speeding and arrested for DUI, blowing well over twice the legal limit on a field sobriety test. He would later plead guilty, receive probation, and be ordered into a 9-month DUI program. 2 people who were supposed to be steadying each other had, within 24 hours of one another, both ended up in police custody. Locklear went to rehab again, but the hottest moment was still ahead. In June 2018, her own mother called 911, this time not about a driving incident or domestic dispute, but because Locklear was in crisis and had made statements about wanting to end her life. Dispatch audio described her as agitated. She was placed on a psychiatric hold, later extended for further evaluation. It was, by any account, the lowest point of the entire saga, not a scandal to be managed by publicists, but a family in genuine crisis, trying to keep someone they loved safe. Her daughter Ava, then 20 years old, reportedly pleaded with her mother to get help. According to people close to the family, Ava told her she wanted her clean and sober for good, and that Richie Sambora, her father, had reached the point of feeling he'd done what he could from the sidelines and needed to see real change. Locklear agreed to go back into treatment. For the first time since 2006, the story wasn't really about the marriage anymore, or even about who was to blame for its ending. It was about whether Heather Locklear was going to be okay. And for a while, that answer was genuinely uncertain. The turn, when it came, wasn't dramatic. There was no single headline announcing that Heather Locklear was better. It happened the way most real recovery does, quietly, over months, mostly out of view. In April 2020, a family friend confirmed to reporters that Locklear and Chris Heiser were engaged. The timing mattered. The engagement coincided with Locklear marking 1 full year of sobriety. She posted about it herself, sharing a passage about how life goes on, how tomorrow tends to be better than today looks from inside a hard moment. Her ex-husband, Richie Sambora, was reportedly among those who reached out with support. Whatever bitterness had existed between them after 2006 had, by 2020, given way to something more practical. 2 parents, still connected through their daughter, no longer defined by how their marriage had ended. The engagement lasted 5 years. Locklear and Heiser were, by most accounts, genuinely happy for long stretches of it. She called him, in one 2021 interview, her man for the rest of her life. But the relationship had never been without turbulence, dating back to his own 2018 DUI arrest and the domestic violence incident that had first brought them into police contact. In 2025, after years of on and off strain, friends confirmed the engagement had quietly ended. People close to Locklear described her, at 63, as being in a genuinely good place, not devastated by the breakup, but settled, and open to whatever came next. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, Locklear also found her way back to acting. In 2024, she took a leading role in a true crime drama, her first significant screen work in years, a quiet signal that the chapter of hospital rooms and court dates wasn't the only chapter left to write. So what really happened to Heather Locklear after she divorced Richie Sambora? The honest answer resists the neat version. The divorce wasn't the single cause of everything that followed. The private struggles that surfaced publicly in 2008 and repeatedly after appear to have been present long before the marriage ended, running underneath the glossy version of her life even at its most golden. But the divorce did mark the moment the structure fell away. What had been contained inside a marriage, however strained, became visible once that marriage was gone, and it took nearly 2 decades, several rock-bottom moments, and the persistence of people who loved her, before Locklear found something steadier to stand on. She was never, in any simple sense, the same after 2006. But maybe that was never really the right question. The more honest one is whether she found her way to something worth having on the other side of all of it, and by the account of the people closest to her, she finally has. Not the version of Heather Locklear that once ruled primetime television, untouchable and camera-ready. Something quieter. Something that took her far longer, and cost her far more, to get to. If you remember her from Dynasty, from Melrose Place, from the years when her face was inescapable, you already know one version of this story. This was the rest of it.